Hi everybody, it's Courtney and I am back here with another design team project for Trinity Stamps. Today we are going to be using this seasonal sweetheart stamp set because fall is right around the corner. It's dipping down to about 40 at night here, so I decided to make a fall themed card. This will be a one-layer card and we're going to kind of create a border with our stamped images. So I'm using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 onto a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock because of course we're going to be using our Copic markers. I started by stamping her little hat there, and then I'm masking that out with some Simon Says Stamp masking paper. And then I will go ahead and stamp her to make it as if she is wearing the hat. So whenever you are masking and creating a one-layer card or a one-layer scene or anything one layer, you'll want to stamp whatever you want in front first. Mask that out and then continue your stamping. So the further back you get is going to be the last images you stamp, if that makes sense. So I want her to be in the front, and I kind of want the pumpkins and leaves to be around her and kind of create a border for the top portion of my card with the pumpkins and the leaves. So I stamped out two of these larger pumpkins here, masked those out with that same Simon Says Stamp masking paper, and then I will continue to stamp the leaves. And I'm not sure if these other ones are pumpkins, but I am going to color them as if they are pumpkins, and nobody will ever know the difference. And so I'm going to fill in here with a couple of leaves. You can see I didn't ink up that stamp too well when I stamped that the second time, but I can always fix that before I begin my coloring. Went ahead and masked out those two, lined that up the best I could without that black image, but actually once I do my ink blending, it will be a lot easier to fill that area in. I didn't want to repeat stamp it because I wasn't confident enough to really line that up correctly. So once all of my stamping was complete, I went ahead and finished off masking everything here, including this last little leaf here that's off to the side. You want to make sure that all of your images are masked before doing your ink blending, because sometimes I tend to forget to mask off the last image and ink blend right over it. So for the ink blending, we are going to be using Bundled Sage, Shabby Shutters, Fossilized Amber, and Wild Honey. I took a piece of Post-it note tape just to place down on the bottom portion of my little, I don't want to call it a frame, but border, I guess, just to make sure I don't go beyond that with my ink blending. You'll see that I'll add another piece too because I was getting fingerprints. Distress oxides tend to stay wet a lot longer and kind of sit on the surface of the paper, so it's easy to get fingerprints in places that you don't want them. So make sure that you're either using a scrap piece of paper or just a Post-it note tape so that you can kind of place that down where you're actually holding the card down. So once I reach the top with the Wild Honey, then I'm going to go in the reverse direction to make sure that all of these colors are blending together. So I started with the Wild Honey on the top, then the Fossilized Amber, then the Bundled Sage, or no, I'm sorry, the Shabby Shutters, and then Bundled Sage on the bottom. I did let this panel dry for about 10 or 15 minutes before removing my masks because, like I said, the Distress Oxides sit on top of the paper. So they pretty much saturate it, but they're also saturating your masks. So they can be a little tough to remove if the paper is still really wet. Sometimes it can tear your paper as you're removing the masks. I like to use the tip of my scissors to kind of get it started and then peel the rest back with my fingers. So once that was done, I did lose some of my black outline, including that one that I didn't actually stamp for that leaf. So I'm taking an EK Success journaling pen to just fill in those areas. Because the Distress Oxides are more opaque than a regular dye ink, they will kind of erase any of your black lines that maybe you didn't mask perfectly, which I never mask perfectly, but I'm always able to fix it up with either a Copic Safe pen or a Copic marker, which in this case, I had to do both. So onto the coloring, I am going to start off with her skin tones here, starting off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas before bringing in that darkest color. The shadows for her face are basically just going to be underneath her hair and on the inside of her little ears. On her one leg, it's going to be a little bit on either side, including those little dash lines that you see for her kneecap. For her one leg, it's kind of bent in a little bit, so I'm only placing shading on one side, but I am extending those little flick lines for her little knees. Blended that out with the E11, then the E00, and then I'll finish off back with my lightest color, that E50. I did bring in the R20 just to add a little bit of color to her cheeks. If it ends up being a little too bright or a little too pink, you can go back in with your lightest color just to kind of tone that down just a little bit. Next, we'll move on to her hair. For hair, I like to start off with the darkest color. So I'm starting off with the E59, and you can see I'm just using the very tip of my marker. You can see that my marker is almost straight up and down, and that's how you'll get into those teeny tiny spaces with the tip of your marker. You just got to make sure that you're barely touching the paper and you're holding that marker straight up and down. I'm adding some shading underneath where her hat is hanging over her hair, and also where her hair is kind of tucked behind her ears, and a little bit on the bottom where it appears to be a little wavy. I'm extending those flicks out just a teeny tiny bit with that E57, again just using the very tip of my marker. Same thing with the E55. I'm just going to extend these areas out even further. You can see here that I'm leaving very little space for a highlight. In fact, you could actually skip the highlight color and just leave the highlights white, and it'll just make it look as if her hair is very shiny. But in this case, I brought in the E53 just to fill in those highlight areas. Next, moving on to her hat and her scarf and mittens there, I am going to be using a combination of YR markers and E markers. So I'm starting off with the the lightest color again, just to map out those darkest areas. I'm just working with a center highlight here, not really too concerned about a light source. And so her shadows for her hat are going to be where it's kind of tucked, not tucked, but kind of gathered together on the top portion, and then a little bit on either side. I'm just extending those areas out a little bit further with each and every color, and just leaving pretty much the center, kind of like a V shape here for that highlight color. I'm going to use this same color combination for her scarf as well as her little mittens. For her scarf, there are some lines within the illustration that will kind of guide you as far as where you need to put your shadows. So where the shadows will be is where it's wrapped around her neck and kind of flipped over, or folded over, I guess. That would create a shadow on either side. Also, where it's kind of laying behind her mittens would also create a shadow. And for her mittens, I'm just adding a little bit of shading on the bottom portion just to add a little bit of contrast. It really doesn't matter in this case where you're putting your shading, just as long as you have a little bit of contrast there. So I'm finishing off with the lightest color just to get those colors to blend a little bit. And for her coat and her little boots there, I'm going to switch over to an E combination. So again, starting off with my lightest color to get those areas mapped out. For her coat, her shadows would be underneath where the scarf is hanging over the coat, underneath where her little arms are hanging over the bottom portion of the coat. Also, it looks like her coat is buttoned. So where one part overlaps the other, I'm also creating a shadow there just to add a little bit more dimension. My darkest color is the E18, and you can see that I'm just pretty much going in with a straight line in my very darkest areas. I don't want to extend this out too far, or else her coat is going to end up way darker than I want it to be. So I'm going to extend those areas out a little bit further with the E15, and here you'll see in the larger areas, this is where I'll start using some flicking motions just to kind of bring that out a little bit further. Same thing with the E13, and you can see that I'm leaving very little highlight area for the E11. To be honest, the E13 and E11, there's not a whole lot of contrast between those two colors anyway. So I'm going to use the same color combination for her boots and for the bottom portion and top portion of her hat. For her hat, I'm going to go right in with the darkest color first because I want to add a little bit of texture, and I want to maintain those flick lines that I'm going to be creating, because this will appear as if it's kind of fluffy or has some texture to it. For her boots, I just added shading for that one boot that's kind of just straight ahead. I'm adding shading on either side. And for the one for her leg that's kind of bent a little bit, I'm only adding shading to the right-hand side and keeping the left for my highlight area. Once I went in with that E11 for the highlight area, we're going to move on to the pumpkins. And I'm only going to show you one because I colored these all exactly the same way. Again, I like to keep a little bit of texture here, so I am going to go directly in with my darkest color. And I am adding shading on a pumpkin. There's kind of like sections, I guess you could say, where it's kind of indented. So I'm adding a little bit of shading there. I'm also adding some flick lines on the bottom and the top. Because this is a round object, the highlight would be in the center. And again, just using some flicking lines. And I'm going with the shape of the pumpkin. So it's more rounded on the edges. So my flick lines will be a little bit more rounded as well. Going in with my two midtones and extending those areas out, again, making sure that my flick lines are curved right along with the shape of the image. And then I'll finish off with the Y35 for the highlight color. For the little stems, I'm just going to use two colors here. In fact, you could probably just use one, being they are so teeny tiny, but I did want to add just a little bit of contrast to these areas. So once that was done, we are going to move on to the leaves. Again, only going to show you one, but here's the color combination that I'm going to be using. It's kind of a variety, but you can see that the last number is either the same or one, possibly two off from the one before. So I'm going to add my green, then I'm going to add my yellow, then the orange, and then the reddish color. Even though it's an E marker, it's more red than brown. And then I'm going to work in the opposite direction to make sure that the colors blend. Remember, the more saturated the paper is, the better they are going to blend. You just want to make sure that you don't oversaturate the paper where your colors may bleed outside the lines. So I went ahead and colored the other two the same exact way. Just going to color in the little buttons on her jacket there, solid with an E marker. Not really too concerned about doing shading there. Next, I'm going to take an YG marker, YG93, and I'm just going to fill in with just the tip of my marker these little outlines that I have around some of my images or around portions of my images where I didn't mask perfectly and the ink blending didn't reach the line of the image itself. So just go in with a Copic marker that best matches the distress ink that you used in the background. So next I'm going to take a sand eraser to get rid of this little fingerprint that I had here before I put my Post-it note tape down. I like to go in with a very light hand. You may have to go in a couple of times, but it will eventually remove or lighten it a lot anyway, depending on the color. I added a few white gel pen details, and I'm just taking a couple of the words from this same stamp set. I used my grid mat here just to make sure that they are completely lined up correctly before popping those onto my acrylic block. I am going to stamp these out with dark chocolate ink by Simon Says Stamp directly underneath my little mini scene that I have going on there. Last, I finished off the card with just a little bit of sparkle with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to her hat and gloves and the pumpkins. And that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.